to Elevate Louisiana Engage podcast. Elevate Louisiana was founded earlier this year to empower women leaders throughout Louisiana by connecting and educating them on the challenges impacting our state with data-driven, nonpartisan solutions to make a better future for Louisiana. Hello, I'm your host, Julie Stokes. Today, we are recording the third episode in a series on the Louisiana's budget and tax system. Our guest joining us today is Kimberly Robinson, who serves as the Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Revenue. Before becoming Secretary of Revenue, Ms. Robinson was a partner in the Tax and Estates Practice Group at Jones Walker, focusing primarily on state and local tax matters, economic development financing, incentives, and government relations. Before joining Jones Walker, Ms. Robinson served as special counsel for the Office of the Governor of the State of Louisiana under Governor Kathleen Blanco, and served as a senior policy advisor on revenue, economic development, and insurance policy. She also worked for 6 years at the Department of Revenue, serving as Assistant Secretary for the Office of Legal Affairs and the confidential assistant to the Secretary. From 1998 to 2000, she also served as judicial clerk to the Honorable Justice Burnett Johnson of Louisiana Supreme Court. She's got a whole lot more accolades and a whole lot more committees that she serves on right now, working in state government in the capacity she's in. But we just are glad that she's here today and want to welcome Secretary Robinson.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here with you today.
Awesome. Well, I know that our guests today will really be listening to hear, what they can expect from the 2021 sessions. And, this is a fiscal session. So every other year in Louisiana is a fiscal session. But what makes this particular one even more interesting is that when you look at a 4-year term for the legislature, there are 2 fiscal sessions in each term. Well, the second fiscal session in each term is election year. So there's not that many elected officials that really want to mess with taxation all that much during an election year. So this fiscal session, being the second one in the second year in their term, is a lot more inviting to those kind of things, and typically the one where you would expect to see big goings on. So we're going to try to catch up, see how COVID is impacting our ability to really do much in that regard, and what we might be able to see in terms of tax reform or what changes we're going to have to make to respond to the current environment. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to Secretary Robinson, who has a slideshow, and we'll just be very conversational about this. So if you are watching or listening to this rather on podcast, you can always refer back if you want to see some of the slides to the Videocast portion that you can find on YouTube. But you can also, I think you'll be able to glean what we're talking about from the spoken word. So at any rate, thank you, Secretary Robinson.
Well, thank you very much. And this is going to be the first fiscal session of this term. And it's going to be, I think, an interesting fiscal session. We do have new members who are interested in the state's tax structure. And so what I want to talk about today, and really it's our tax system, but it's it's looking back and it's looking forward. As a former member of the Ways and Means Committee, that we spent most of the last term talking about our tax system and how to address some of the structural issues with our tax system. What we did do to address the fiscal cliff that plagued us for most of that last term, and that fiscal cliff is set to be on the horizon again in 2025 when that revenue that we put in place goes away. So this is the first session to look at that 2025 fiscal cliff. The 2021 session, because as you mentioned, 2023 is the second fiscal session, but it's also going to be the election year session that most legislators don't want to address taxes in that year. And in 2025, that sunset is June 30th. So it puts a lot of pressure on that new legislature or those members that are returning to address a fiscal cliff in a session that would end at the beginning of June and have to address it in 2025. So this is that first opportunity to look at that issue again.
So what you're saying is that we do have a chance, if we wanted to take it, to correct our problems so that we don't have a cliff in the future. Um, Knowing what I know and serving after a while, it's like I'm sure that we will wait until the last minute to fix that looming problem. But you know, you never know, because every couple of years now, every few years, you get a new crop of legislators, so you never know. So
Well, you never know what's going to happen, but let's look at the past and let's look at what may happen.
good.
So let's look at a little bit of history, just a little bit. When we start talking about our state tax base, I always like to help everyone understand where we've come from. Back in 1981, since the 2021 is the year that's coming up, back in 1981, mineral revenue made up 42% of our tax base. Here we are going into 2021, mineral revenue is 4.5% of that tax base. This is fiscal year 2019-20. So ending June 30th of 2020. The largest portion of our tax revenue base now, personal income tax and sales tax. Those two make up 62% of our tax base. The tables have turned.
Yeah.
We are no longer dependent upon mineral revenue. Our focus has definitely changed. We also now have gaming revenue making up a larger share of our tax base than mineral revenue when you look at the breakdown.
So I have a question. Mineral revenue, is it that it has shrunk in actual dollars, or is it that our other industries that we have represent a more significant portion, or have we just stopped collecting as much mineral revenue?
So we've had a combination of all of those things. We also don't have as much onshore production of minerals as we previously had. Louisiana is still a oil and gas rich state, but you have a difference in the amount of production that takes place onshore in Louisiana. You also have a difference in the price of oil and gas. And so as you have those differences and where the drilling takes place, where the severance tax is paid, if you don't have drilling onshore, there's no severance tax being paid in Louisiana. If you don't have drilling on state lands, there's no royalty revenue going into state coffers. So you've seen those changes. You've also seen a diversification of industry. You do see more, we have refineries, but that's not severance tax. That's revenue going into other streams. And if the oil and gas that's being processed in Louisiana is going offshore or to other states, that's a different tax structure altogether. So
Right.
so those things change.
So the money, the royalty revenues for offshore drilling, which is a bigger portion, is what you're saying now than it used to be. That offshore money goes to the federal government, and instead of the state.
On our share of that revenue coming back in through a different mechanism.
It's probably not quite as much as it would be if it was all on Louisiana land.
Right.
So, gotcha.
Correct. So when you look at those changes, you see that our tax base has changed in the last 30 years.
Yep, a lot.
And you also see that our general fund, well, previously back in 1981, 82, our general fund was the largest share of our total revenue spent. Now, as we've changed, more of our dollars come from the federal government, bringing those federal dollars back home.
And aren't we, I think we're like the second largest recipient of federal funds in the United States. Like Mississippi still might outrank us, but next in comes us. And a lot of that is Medicaid money, correct?
Correct.
I
We
wouldn't
are
think.
bringing that back, and we've also seen that we're bringing money home for coastal projects.
Yeah,
We're seeing that those dollars come back to Louisiana as well.
right.
So when you look to our income tax, one of the things that we've seen the income tax grow to be such a large percentage of our budget. One of the things that has been important over the last 20 years on the income tax front has been the Stelly plan. Now, this past week, we lost Vic Stelly to COVID-19. We lost both he and his wife to COVID-19.
Yeah, I know, breaks my heart. I felt a little bit of a kindred spirit to him because tax reform was important to both of us, and he sure did succeed in his endeavor, but it was a hard fought, it was a hard won fight.
It definitely was a hard won battle for him on the Stelly plan. But he went around the state explaining this to make the voters understand, and it passed. But there were two components to the proposal, an individual income tax component and a sales tax component.
It was basically a swap, right? Like it was basically swapped.
We were making a swap. We would have sales tax exemptions that went into the Constitution. And the trade-off for the sales tax was going to be income tax. We pay a little bit more in income tax. Most people don't see the income tax increase because it's in withholding that comes out of your paycheck every 2 weeks. So we pay a little bit more in income tax, but it would give us a broader income tax base. And we'd give up sales tax on food for home consumption, residential utilities, and prescription drugs, the basic necessities of life. That was the trade-off.
So one of the interesting things about that, when you tie it into your last slide, is that for years, those sales tax exemptions for food for home consumption, residential utilities, and prescription drugs were just in statute. So when the oil bust happened, which was what, like 86 or something like that, and oil severance revenue just decreased year after year, you would see fluctuations, and the legislature would come in every year and let those things be exempt or make those things be taxable in order to fill the gaps that they had in the state budget to get the budget balanced. And that was part of, Vic Stelly's whole crusade was, let's stop having this, we do it this year, we don't do it the next year sort of tax system. Let's stabilize it by making those exemptions permanent and increasing individual income tax.
Yes, the temporary suspension of exemptions. So we temporarily suspended the exemptions for 2 years, for 30 years almost.
Mm-hmm.
Every 2 years, those exemptions were suspended.
Yep.
And so these were protected in the Constitution. They weren't going to be subject to the temporary suspension. And we eliminated the excess federal itemized deduction. So for people that itemize on their federal returns, they get a deduction of the excess amount, meaning the difference between the standard deduction and their itemized deduction amount. We were going to change our brackets, and we'd make that trade-off. So the next slide kind of goes into those details. Before Stelly, we had the 2%, 4%, and 6% rates. So this is just on the single filing status. First $10,000 was 2%. Then on the next 40,000, so from 10,000 to 50,000, you paid 4%. Over 50,000, you paid 6%. Stelly, we sought to make it a little more compressed. 12,500, we raised that slightly. We lowered the 6% to 25,000. And so you paid the 4% from 12.5 to 25. And so everybody started paying at 6% at 25,000.
Right, which was a big increase in taxes generally when taken with the fact that we went from allowing people to do 57.5% of their excess itemized deductions to essentially being 0% of their excess itemized deductions.
So it was a big increase for some people. It was a few $100s for some people. Yeah. For some people, it was a few $1,000s. Right. The other, so ultimately, what we did, and before I guess I get to that point, the big change for people with this, the tables where we do withholding, were in statute. So Stelly passed and became effective. The voters passed the constitutional amendment and Stelly became effective. 2004 happened and the withholding started in January, and there was no change for withholding.
Right.
The tables were not changed because they were in statute.
Right.
So when everyone paid their taxes the next year, they owed money for state tax. Needed to change the withholding tables as a part of, if the constitutional amendment passes, we also need to change the withholding tables because the withholding tables were in statute and were so many pages. It was like, well, if we change all of this and this doesn't pass, we've put all of this in statute. And so it was, if this happens, this is the new withholding tables. If it passes, we'll change the withholding tables.
I always talk about it kind of as a perfect storm, because this thing gets passed by the voters and then nobody's having the right amount withheld. So everybody owes big tax bills. And then subsequent, in walks Hurricane Katrina and this false economy and a brand new legislature. And it just really was an entire perfect storm because voter sentiment was so negative toward the Stelly plan because of the big balances that people owed on their tax returns, that it just, public opinion had been shifted tremendously.
Yes, that was the biggest issue, was public opinion of, I have to pay the state, I don't ever pay the state, or if I pay the state, I pay $20 or some nominal amount. But having to pay state taxes was a new phenomenon for many people. Right. And so that was the issue. So you get to the 2008 session, and really the 2007 election, there were a lot of people who ran on repealing Stelly. Right.
And it was the first time that term limits had ever been instituted in the state. So you had like 67% of legislature turning over with a freshman crew that really had never been in state government before. And we had massive surpluses because of Hurricane Katrina rebuilding, a brand new legislature, and public sentiment just really very much against the Stelly plan. And the result of that was the repeal that I know you're getting ready to talk about.
You got that right. You go back to changing the brackets back. So you say, nope, we're going back to the Stelly brackets. Still the 2% rate, but the 6% goes back to the 50,000. We left the 12.5 because that's now in the Constitution.
Right.
So we couldn't go back to the 10,000. So we left that 12.5 and we balanced it out with the 37.5.
Right.
To get to the 50. So we go back to that point.
The way I always tell people
back.
too. Right, because we repeal the Stelly plan, but we don't take away the sales tax exemptions, right?
Right. So we didn't do that. So we didn't revert all the way back to Stelly because we've now got this in the Constitution. So the 12.5 is now the minimum amount in the Constitution. So we can't go back to the 10,000.
Right.
And then the other thing we've got in the Constitution, which we're not even talking about. The other piece of this is the excess itemized. Stelly had 57.5 as the deduction you get. You take it to 0. We're like, nope, we're going to phase in a different deduction starting in 2007. We took it to 100%. That was never the amount. It was always just 57.5. We took it to 57.5 immediately. And I'm saying we, the legislature, in 2007.
Yep.
65% in 2008, and then in 2009, 100%. Again, fueled by the surpluses of the Katrina economy and Katrina
Right.
and Rita economy.
Yep.
And so they made this decision. So you have this change in 2007, and then in 2008, the new legislators come in and they change the rates and brackets.
Right.
So again, you're not reverting back to Stelly.
Right.
But on the sales tax side, you don't make any changes. You leave all those exemptions in the Constitution.
Right.
So sales tax revenue does not get replaced. Income tax revenue that was set to offset it goes away.
Yeah. So what I would always say, it's like you had this mostly revenue neutral plan where you swap income tax for sales tax. So now you've got increased sales tax, less sales tax. I mean, increased income tax and less sales tax. Then you repeal only the revenue generators out of this swap. So now you've gotten rid of the income tax. So now you're in the hole. But not only do they go back and get rid of the generators out of a revenue neutral plan, but they also have 2 baked in losses. Number one of which being that, you know, that 2% tax no longer only applied to $10,000. It now applies to $12,500.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, you know, over $100 million of change in today's dollars already. And then the change from having 57.5% of your excess itemized deductions to 100% of your excess itemized deductions, that's another probably over $200 million that you, not only did you get rid of the swap, but you also dialed back additionally with those 2 baked in losses.
Yes, so you've done a disservice to the state's revenues with the way that Stelly was partially repealed, because we won't call it a full repeal. We'll call it the partial repeal of Stelly.
Michael Hecht at GNO Inc. called it the half Stelly.
The half Stelly.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we started 2016 with all of the Stelly changes, the Katrina Rita economy finally decreasing, the impact of the recession hitting the state, and the decrease in the price of oil impacting the state, because we went from $100+ oil down to less than $40 oil.
Well, and I remember in 2015 how bad we thought it was, because it went from over 100 to like maybe 50 something in the last year of the Jindal administration. And then when we walked back in the very next year, under the first year of the Edwards administration, it had gone to $28 a barrel, I think, when we first started. And so it was a tragic economic and fiscal situation, and it really was.
Yes, when we were working transition, I was working with the Jindal administration to go through the numbers, what exactly was in the budget, what were the revenues looking like before REC met, and then the December REC meeting, what would be coming out of it. And every time I briefed the governor-elect at the time, Governor Edwards, he'd say, every time you come in here, you have worse news.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to stop coming. I said, I'm thinking about not coming back. This is just, it's not getting any better.
Nobody would have blamed you. I had nicknamed myself with all the speeches I was giving at the time, trying to explain what was going on. I said, I am the prophetess of doom. It is unfortunate, but it was a bad situation. And so we're still piecing together those parts.
We are piecing together. So it's like, what do we do? How do we move forward? How do we address this situation? And so we had a path forward. or so we thought. We had a path forward. We start 2016 with a special session, the first special session of many of that term. And then Representative John Schroeder, now our treasurer, John Schroeder, passed a piece of legislation creating a task force on structural changes in budget and tax policy. And this task force started its work in March. And we looked at every aspect of our state's revenues. And this was a task force of experts. Some people called us the dream team. Other people called us the pointy head people. You know, it just depended on your view.
Yeah.
But we had 3 economists, also the 3 economists who had written a report and recommendations for the state on what the tax structure should look like, that being
Right.
Dr. Jim Richardson, Dr. Jim Alm, and Dr. Steve Sheffrin.
Right. When Chuck Cluckley was speaker and he called for that, it was probably him and Ilario together. Yeah.
Yeah, so we had those 3 members. We had Public Affairs Research Council, the Council for a Better Louisiana,
Yep.
Association of Business and Industry, the Committee for 100, or Committee of 100 for a Better Louisiana. We had all of those persons participating in this task force to make recommendations. The Louisiana Municipal Association had a member on the task force, as well as the AFL-CIO. Every person participated in all the meetings, myself as well as the Commissioner of Administration participated. We did not have, we didn't have a shortage of meetings. Our meetings were never short either. They were always several hours. And we had presentations from those persons who were interested in the state's financial future. Both citizens, business organizations, good government organizations, national organizations came in, local government, anyone who wanted to make a presentation, as well as send in written materials, came and did that. And we looked at all the tax types. We looked at the different fiscal issues facing the state, and we prepared a report of our recommendations. The biggest issues facing the state fisc, so to speak. And so we made recommendations on the sales tax, because at the time that this group was working, our state sales tax had been increased by 1 cent to a 5% state sales tax. So we had a recommendation to reduce that sales tax back down to the 4% rate, eliminating certain exemptions from the sales tax base, following some recommendations from a little commission that you were chairing, the Sales Tax Streamlining and Modernization Commission. You were also working and had been working on this commission to make recommendations that would both streamline and modernize and provide some uniformity between the state's base and the local's base, and get us closer to hopefully being able to adopt the streamlined sales tax project should Congress act on allowing states to collect sales tax from remote sellers. The fact that we needed congressional action to do that seems like such a long time ago, since we've moved beyond that at this point. But those were,
because we'd still be waiting for that.
We'd still be waiting for that to happen. But fortunately, we had a little case out of the Supreme Court, Wayfair.
Yep.
I started having a new appreciation for the Wayfair commercial, where they, you know, it's like the commercial and they get whatever the item is. It's like, wow, Wayfair has free shipping. Game changer. And the Wayfair decision out of the Supreme Court, definitely a game changer for purposes of state sales tax collection. So but those
So,
recommendations.
so yeah, I mean, part of the reason why we did the Sales Tax Streamlining Commission is because we knew that uh, the theory was that you had to have the same set of things taxable at the local level and at the state level. And because of all the sales tax exemptions we have in Louisiana statute, there were different sets of things taxable in every parish as the state. And we were one of less than a handful of states that were like that. So, that was one of the issues that our sales tax system had. The other one was that we had a decentralized system of collection. So, whereas in the vast majority of states, and again, I think we were part of a small handful that had individual parishes collecting and the state also collecting, most states collected with one state collector and then dispersed the money back to the counties in their case. And that, it creates a lot of burdensome, it's very burdensome to business, who might get audited by the same by different parishes in the same year, who two different parishes might disagree about who should get the tax revenue. And then the company might be paying both parishes for the tax revenue. So, I mean, there are disadvantages. It's a very difficult system to do away with. And I know there's a lot of movement on that right now. So I definitely want to talk about that.
But yeah, so that was part of the recommendations, recognizing that being able to collect those sales tax on those remote sales or those internet sales was going to be critical to the future of the state. Digital transactions is definitely the future. If 2020 has taught us nothing else, online shopping is what everyone is doing.
Yep.
So dealing with those base uniformity and exemption issues was part of the recommendations of the HCR 11 task force, and recognizing that some of the issues that we have in our sales tax system, including the centralized collection issue, may require a broader look than just a statutory provision. The other part of that was to look at taxing services, that we had to expand our sales tax base. The Louisiana sales tax was enacted in the early 30s. And for the most part, those same sales tax provisions have been in place since the 30s and have not changed in most instances. Exemptions have been added, but the overall structure of the sales tax itself has not changed. We still tax some of the same things that we taxed in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
The furnishing of sleeping rooms, when most people have no idea what you're talking about when you talk about the furnishing of sleeping rooms. What? Well, yes, it's a hotel, but in the 30s and 40s, it was the furnishing of a sleeping room. The taxation on dry cleaning services and the cleaning of furs and carpets. People didn't think about the fact that you cleaned your furs, but that was a luxury item being cleaned and it was taxed. The furnishing of cold storage space. Well, why is that? Because that was important. People didn't have, cold storage and warehouses was very important. And so that was one of our taxable services. So now we have a lot of services that are taxed in other states. The service economy is more prevalent than the transactional economy, and we just don't tax those services. We also don't tax things that are digitally delivered. We don't tax things that we traditionally purchased in tangible form that we now receive in digital form. I download music from my iTunes or my Apple account, whereas I used to go and buy, either showing my age, an LP or a CD, a cassette tape, or a CD.
Yeah.
Now I just download the song. Well,
Right.
when you went to the store to buy any of those other things, you paid sales tax. Now we got to make sure that we have a tax structure that taxes that download of the digital
Yeah.
life. So those are the
Right.
kind of things that we have to modernize our system.
Right. So there were basically three issues in sales tax. First, you have the decentralized collections. And so that's something that people are working on right now and you could see, come up. Then you
Mm-hmm.
had the base being different. So, the net effect of that is that if the state taxes something and the locals don't tax it, then you have to make the locals tax it or the state has to stop taxing it, and vice versa, which is more
Right.
often what happens is that the state will exempt something and the locals don't exempt it.
Correct.
So if you want to make the base the same, you basically either have to decide that the state is going to start taxing it too, or force the locals to exempt it. And if you
Correct.
force the locals to exempt it, you've got to try to find a way to replace that revenue. So that's one of the big problems with trying to make the base the same. And some of the base differences that create the base differences, for example, prescription drugs and groceries, those are constitutionally, our state can't tax those things, but some of the parishes still tax them. So in a sense, no matter how hard you work on base equalization or making the bases the same, without a constitutional vote of the people to either be taxed on those things or to bar the local governments from taxing those things, you're never going to get there. So it's a very daunting, complicated task.
Correct. Which is why the sales tax recommendations from the HR 11 task force recognize that the most effective way to achieve the objectives that were laid out was probably a proposed constitutional amendment, which would allow the people to approve a single system for the uniform collection, but also the uniform base issues that had to be addressed. It was just probably the most efficient and effective way to do that. And I'll just point out that House Resolution 31 by the Speaker this past session, I guess that was the second special session, again dealt with the administration and collection issue, the state and local collection issue, and so created a study group, and that study group met for a few months and has a proposed report that will be addressed during the upcoming session to look at a constitutional amendment that would create a centralized
Collector.
state and local collection board to oversee a single collection entity for state and local taxes. There are still a lot of pieces and details to be worked out, including whether that entity is a collection only entity, whether audits will be included in that entity, whether policy making for rulemaking, policy making will be handled by that entity, or whether the state and local entities will continue to set policy and this entity will simply implement it. Lots of things that are still being addressed and worked through, but definitely a recommendation to move forward.
So, okay, I have to ask, what are the odds? Because if you'd have told me that this had a shot a couple of years ago, I'd have laughed. But it does seem like there is a shot right now. What do you think? If you were making odds.
I think this has come a lot further than it has in the last several years. Local government laid out the proposal for the board structure. Now, there were some things that the state had issue with. The proposal had a much broader board membership for locals than the state. If we're collecting state and local tax, I think definitely the membership has to at least be equal for the state and the local administrators. the business community definitely wants to make sure that audits are included. They don't want to have an entity that that collects the tax, but they're still subject to audit by multiple local collectors. So I think the audit issue is one that is going to be a concern for both sides. And I think the uniformity issue, local government has made clear if we're going to do audits, we need to make sure that we're addressing uniformity and those other outstanding issues. So
could you structure?
Those are those details, but do you get a structure and do you start the process and you continue moving forward? You put a constitutional amendment before the voters.
If you could structure it as a pool of auditors that all works together with a kind of common, I know part of the issue is that different auditing firms do things different ways, and to have a common set of procedures and that all the same people that do the audits could be part of that pool. There's just got to be a way that we can standardize it and still, you know, make sure that the people that are in business doing these things can be held together, you know, because I mean, we won't need necessarily really less audits. We just need to work together and coordinate. I mean, one would think, right?
One would think that, and I think that, you know, what I presented to the study group is the concept of you have a single audit of a taxpayer by this board. Whoever decides that the taxpayer should be audited gets to say, we audit taxpayer X. That parish or the state, if it's the state that selects the taxpayer for audit, conducts the audit. And all the other taxing bodies opt into that audit.
Yeah.
That is the audit of that taxpayer, and the information collected in that audit is used for those taxable periods for that taxpayer, so that the taxpayer is not audited by multiple taxing bodies, but that single audit takes place. And so you get, if you're the local taxing body and you use a contract auditor, your contract auditor would still be conducting the audit on your behalf. This body would set certain standards for how the audits are conducted, but they would conduct the audit, and they would have to do the audit on behalf of all the sales tax collectors in the state. In this case, they'd be conducting the audit on behalf of 64 taxing bodies, because Cameron Parish still doesn't have a sales tax. So
so what do you do about the fact that you might have two jurisdictions that really believe that the sales tax is owed to them? I mean, I can think of some cases where, you know, both Jefferson Parish and St. Charles Parish thought that they were owed the tax. And, you know, so then would you have the fact that now you have this centralized board would have to make a binding decision on that, or how would that work?
So you have different ways to do that. And right now you have the ability for the taxpayer to pay that tax under protest and go to the Board of Tax Appeals. So I think you would use the mechanism of the local tax judge at the Board of Tax Appeals, which is Cade Cole currently, handling that dispute to decide the legal issue of which parish is entitled to tax that transaction. I think that is the safest method to resolve those types of disputes, to not necessarily have the board making that decision, but to continue to go the route of the local tax judge at the BTA making that decision.
That makes sense. Would that still be appealable in like district court or whatever, or would
I think you continue the same appeal process that you have through the court system if the two parishes don't agree with the ruling of the local tax judge. So I think that's the easiest way to deal with that. But those are things that I think the report of the HR 31 study group, and ultimately what that legislative draft, be it a constitutional amendment that is a broad brush constitutional amendment, and you put the details in the statute, because I think that was also one of the things that the study group recommended, that we not put all of the details in the Constitution, because when you put all of the details in the Constitution, you can't change them. So that
Well, right.
broad language and really just put everything else in statute.
Right. And don't put the tax tables, thinking
In
about the
statute.
income.
The tax tables are no longer in statute. So we didn't have that issue most recently. The tax tables are now in a regulation. So we can easily change them. We changed them when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed at the federal level at the end of 2018. We changed those withholding tables immediately through an emergency regulation and had them in place quickly. So that you bring up withholding tables, and that takes us to the income tax recommendations.
Good segue.
Good segue. Task force had two broad recommendations. Constitutional recommendation, which is to change that constitutional provision on the federal income tax deduction. Louisiana is one of 3 states that gives 100% deduction for your federal income taxes paid.
Right.
By removing that, you can expand the base and you can lower the rates. So we can go from having the highest rate being 6% down to a lower rate. 2%, 4%, 6%. We could go to, that rate being 2% or down to maybe a 1.5% rate, 3.75% rate, or 3.5% rate, and a 5% rate, or something along those lines.
And so this is one of the truly great opportunities that I just see as something that should happen. You don't want to tie yourself to the federal tax code. So by allowing a deduction of federal income taxes, you're basically allowing your state's fiscal affairs to be tied to whether or not federal taxes go up or down. And I watched as for 3 years, we couldn't get it passed to get rid of the federal income tax deduction. I mean, political people had even passed resolutions against getting rid of the federal income tax deduction when we were one of only 3 states that had it. And the ironic part of it is that we would have used it to bring down rates and had we could have done a revenue neutral and as bracket neutral as you could get and untied ourselves from the federal system. And the irony of it is that when the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed, and federal taxes went way down, then all of a sudden, because we hadn't got rid of the federal income tax deduction, that federal income tax deduction goes away, not completely, but goes down a lot. And all of a sudden, Louisiana income taxes go up a whole bunch. And that's why you want to get rid of it, though, so that you're not living in the fluctuation of a different system.
But we've not done that just yet. And so the other, and then of course you change the excess itemized deduction, which is also tied to the federal income tax.
Right.
Do away with that. And then if you don't make a constitutional change, then you do the statutory change. Again, the only thing you do is do away with the excess itemized deduction, which gives you some ability to expand the tax base, but you don't have, and you go back and narrow those brackets so that you bring that 50,000 as the starting point for the 6% back down to that 25,000, so that you don't reduce rates, but you do at least narrow those brackets again.
Right.
So those were the recommendations on the individual income tax. And they also made some corporate income and franchise recommendations. Again, federal income tax deduction applies on the corporate side. That was on the ballot in November of 2016. The voters rejected it.
Right. And that, again, I think it's less than 3 states. I think it's 2 states that allow the deduction of federal income taxes against their state income tax calculation. But, the voters in the state are really scared. If anything has the word tax in it.
It takes a lot of explaining, as
it does.
Vic Stelly knew when he got the Stelly plan passed.
Yep.
The other thing was on the question of corporate income tax and the combined reporting system. That report was done. I think it's sitting on the shelf at the legislature. It's not a recommendation. It just explains the combined reporting system. And then the other report is still being looked at by the Tax Institute, and that's a restructuring, phase out, or elimination of the corporate franchise tax. And really the issue is, what do you replace the corporate franchise tax with if you are going to replace it or repeal it? What do you do to make up the 150 to 250 million after credits, that number?
Right.
How do you replace that revenue? And if you start looking at before credits, you're getting into the 300 to 400 million number.
Right, because there was a point at which it looked like it was this tiny little number. Like, I remember, I think one year it was like down to like $50 million, and it's like, well, let's just repeal it. But then you find out that all the credits coming off of it, that really behind that 50 million was like 400 million at that point. Yeah.
So that's the question.
Yep.
So we talked a little bit about that, the impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the federal level. When federal taxes go down, the converse is true in Louisiana. You have an increase, and when federal taxes go up, ours go down. So you can just see from this chart, from 2017 tax year to the 2018 tax year, the number of itemized deductions, returns claiming it. 2017, over 500,000 returns claiming it. You get to 2018, less than 250,000 returns. Again,
and that's probably primarily because the state and local tax deduction, right? Because at a point, then you could only take $10,000 worth of state and local taxes. So that was
you had a cap on the state and local tax deduction, but the primary issue with the federal itemized deduction is the standard deduction at the federal level was increased. So many people who were itemizers are no longer itemizers at all. Gotcha. The other piece of this is the federal income tax deduction. The number of returns claiming the FIT deduction, just the impact of that and the amount of tax due. You saw an increase in the amount of tax due on returns in 2018 versus 2017. Right. Just that impact.
So, I mean, we saw that when the Trump administration reduced federal income taxes, that we saw an increase in Louisiana tax. Correct. Could the same be said that if the economy and everything is in a place where the Biden administration feels like they have to increase state income taxes, would then Louisiana's revenue share of its own taxes decrease? And the answer's got to be yes.
Yes, corresponding change will happen.
And through no legislation of our own, it puts us in a tight spot. And that's something that, I mean, barring the fact that we're in this, big recession because of the COVID crisis, that is a very real, palpable thing that could happen. And then we're going to be even deeper in the hole. So that's kind of scary.
That's always been the possibility that whatever change in the personal income tax changes were not permanent at the federal level. Yep. They sunset at the end in 2025 as well.
That too, right? Exactly. Yep.
So this year, you were just talking about the hole that we're in. Adopted forecast, $867 million impact on the current fiscal year. The legislative auditor estimates local government having a decrease of their revenues between 400 million and 1.1 billion. So that their average total loss over 2 fiscal years would be about $787 million for local governments.
Yeah.
And so when we look at just this year, we've stayed afloat in this year's budget using the $1.8 billion of CARES Act funding that came from the federal government. The state plugged its budget deficit by using CARES Act dollars, $947 million, and the local governments have been using $530 million in their budgets. We couldn't use it to replace lost revenue, but what we could do with it is use the CARES Act dollars to pay for COVID-19 related cost. So the cost of providing frontline workers, so our employees at LDH are our employees in correction services or state police, the National Guard, the cost of PPE, personal protective equipment for employees, the cost of for higher ed or K through 12 to provide broadband access or computers to students, those kind of costs. We could use this money in our budget to pay for those things. So we've filled holes in the budget using CARES Act dollars. So
yeah. So what concerned me, and I know you're getting ready to get to, is that this new package that was passed a couple of days ago, which would have been like December 28th, that did not have a similar infusion for state and local governments.
that is the concern. We did not get a similar infusion in the new version of the stimulus bill that passed. This new 5,593 page bill that passed the Congress last week, just before the Christmas holiday, and I think they are they've got multiple pieces of the bill, but it did not include state and local funding. So we don't have 1.8 billion of dollars coming in, and we have to look at what next year's budget will be based upon. There will be a meeting of the Revenue Estimating Conference in January to talk about the FY22 forecast, but we have to build a budget without those dollars in it, and with the forecast, I'm sure,
Yeah.
using the same method that this year's forecast has been built on, assuming we're not going to have the recovery by July 1. We are, the vaccine is being rolled out in the state. That is definitely the light at the end of the tunnel. So we're starting on the path to recovery. But what the next fiscal year will look like in terms of our economic recovery and how far we will be along on the path of businesses being back open and the economy resurging is definitely an unknown. So we will have some fiscal issues to contend with, whether they will be at the level that this year's was, and whether there will be another round of federal stimulus is not known. The president-elect has said that what was passed last week is a good start. There are some dollars that come to different agencies in state government. So there's dollars for vaccine rollout. There are some dollars for broadband access. There will also be dollars for testing, continued cost of testing. So those are things that will help with some of the costs that the state will have over the next year. But it is not necessarily revenue that can be used to fill the other areas of the budget as we talk about where our general fund priorities are. So when you look at where our state general fund is spent, there are numerous areas of the budget that that 9.7 billion of general fund dollars goes to.
Yeah.
The largest being K through 12 education, the minimum foundation program. And then the
which we don't have a lot of ability to cut into because it's a constitutionally driven formula. I just wanted to interject.
That is correct. It is a constitutionally mandated cost. We do not get to change that. We also have the cost of health care that our Department of Health administers. And I'm not sure if you've seen the updates over the last week, but there have been a few newspaper articles that 39% of our citizens are now on Medicaid. That is a large percentage of the population.
Yeah. And when you cut $1 in the Department of Health, you typically lose $3 of federal match funding that comes back to our state. So every cut in that area is much deeper than what, if we save $1, we lose $3. So it's really a $4 cut to save us $1.
Correct. And you also have 1.1 billion that went to higher education. And that's not just money to higher education to the institutions. That's where the TOPS funding is as well. So that's the money that our students who have received the TOPS scholarships, their money is there as well.
Yeah.
So this is, when you look at just this amount of money, you're at 70% of the general fund dollars.
Right. So we're really in a tough situation. I mean, we could do tax reform, maybe that's revenue neutral, but it would be pretty difficult, especially with COVID, to do anything that eliminated a tax type or created any more loss, because it looks like it's going to be, it would be a pretty tight budget in which to make any further cuts, if I had to guess.
It would be a very tight budget to make cuts, and we don't have really any discretion, so to speak, in where we spend money. This next slide just looks at those general fund dollars, and they're constitutionally mandated cost. The MFP that we talked about for K through 12 education, the cost of elections are in the Constitution. Our debt service, we put the payment of our debts in the Constitution, the full faith and credit of the state. It's in the Constitution. We will pay our debt service. When we borrow money, we're going to pay it. So that's in the Constitution. That money, we don't get to say we're going to cut that and not pay it. Supplemental pay for law enforcement, revenue sharing with local government, those are all in the Constitution. Those aren't things that we get to decide we're paying that this year or we're not paying it. So those aren't necessarily cuts that we can go and make. We also have certain other things that we have to pay for. There's a minimum level of Medicaid services that are required to be made if we're going to participate in the federal Medicaid program that's mandated by the federal government. Those are costs that we have to pay. So there's a minimum amount that we have to pay for Medicaid. Those are things that we don't get to choose yes or no. So those are some of the things that we have no discretion over. When you get to the amount of those non-discretionary costs in the current budget and then in next year's budget, it's over 70% in this year's budget. And next year's budget, the forecast is that's going to be over 75%.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you're looking at potentially having another gaping hole in the revenues from COVID continuing into next year, possibly, likely to some degree, and you don't necessarily know if the CARES Act or similar dollars are going to come in, it really puts us in a precarious situation, huh?
It definitely puts us in a precarious situation. And when you look at your general fund dollars, and we've talked about the fact that 30% of the general fund is sales tax and 30% is individual income tax. At 60% are those two major tax types, what tax reform do you do that impacts those two taxes that you don't risk losing any of the revenue associated with those tax types? You've got to be very careful in making those types of decisions, lest you risk having a negative impact on what is already very, very tight dollars to fund these services that are both constitutionally mandated services and critical services. And these are also services that have been, when you look back over the last several fiscal years, the funding for these programs have been at the same level for a number of years. Now, there are people who will go through and talk about savings in the Medicaid program or savings at LDH. Those are things that I think people will continue to debate back and forward. And that's, again, programmatic savings more so than it is tax reform or tax changes that can be made. The other area that people talk a lot about is the tax exemption budget. Whether we can save money on the $6.7 billion of exemptions that the state has in place. Well, you get into the TEB, and I know you've studied the TEB, you've spent a lot of time with it.
Way too much.
But these exemption categories are not necessarily the same. They're not easy places to pick off large dollars.
Right.
We just talked in great deal about the federal income tax deductions. So both corporate and individual. Oh yeah, there you go. We cut that. That's $822 million off the top. We can save that. Well, that's the federal income tax deduction. If you simply take that away, you make no adjustment whatsoever to the rates, you're giving every corporation, every individual, and when I say every individual, that includes every LLC, every partnership, and every trust and estate in the state of Louisiana that pays tax, a tax increase.
Right.
Because you're repealing the federal income tax deduction. You're making no change to the rates, so their tax is going to go up. That's what the effect of that is.
We couldn't even pass that when it was revenue neutral and for the most part bracket neutral. So that's not really going to be a thing that I think you'll see happen. And another thing is that if you're looking at the slides right now, you'll notice that federal income tax deduction is in the column for that. It's in the Constitution. So not only would the legislature have to do it, but the people would have to vote on it. And, the chance of the people getting rid of that deduction and taxing themselves is fairly low. And besides the fact that it wouldn't happen, the revenue wouldn't come in time to save the day anyway.
Right. And the other big number in there on the sales tax exemptions that are in the Constitution, that's that food for home consumption that we talked about.
Yep. And
those prescription drugs.
Right.
Yeah.
$1.5 billion basically. And so, that's a lot of dollars, and there's really nothing you can do with them. Right.
Yeah, residential utilities, those aren't going to go,
right.
Those aren't going to be voted upon and go quietly into the night.
No, you really can't get, so if we take everything that's in the Constitution off the table, we need something that the legislature can do now. Take everything that's in the Constitution off the table, at least for now. Take the federally imposed tax exemptions, that it's like another $250 million off the table. Then you're left with $4.2 billion of additional tax exemptions. But then, when you really study that and you look at, like for instance, sales tax, you find out that, a big chunk of the sales tax, that's $965 million that's left over, $275 million of that is purchases by state and local governments that no state charges their own counties taxes. So
Right.
you'd be a real outlier. I mean, that would be a really interesting thing to do. And
Mm-hmm.
then you've got the sales or the business utilities, and that's one thing that was passed some time ago, and the business
Right.
interests hold on to very strongly. And then the other thing that kind of goes in tandem with that was manufacturing machinery and equipment. These were two big Jindal era, and actually they started in the Blanco
No,
administration.
yeah, M&E is Governor Blanco.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, these were big economic development items that, were put on the table to try to, help us develop a stronger economy. So you're probably not going to get rid of those two things. You're not going to get rid of the sales tax on the state and local governments. And then you're left with little things from there. You have sale for resale. And things that you just wouldn't get rid of, so all in all you're down to a small amount that you could really
Right.
manipulate
And yeah, and on that corporate income tax side, the big
hmm
chunk of that $1 billion that's sitting there on the corporate income tax side is the
yeah
subchapter S
yeah
deduction. So
right
that's where sub S corporations, there's a deduction on the corporate side, but the sub S's, the members of the sub S's pay the tax at the individual level. So
right
you'd
i
be
remember
you'd be
i remember
taxing the sub S at the corporate level.
right
And so you're either taxing it there and still taxing it at the individual, or you're
right
going to tax both. So,
right well, and I remember when we were sitting in a meeting one time, somebody said, well, there you go, let's just get rid of that one, we can solve the whole thing. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. This isn't like an optional thing. This is something that you do to eliminate double taxation for a whole
right,
specific class of business. And then net operating losses you have there, that's almost 200 million.
right,
You have things like that so that when companies have dire situations like they do this year, that they can take that loss and push it forward to the future and be able to claim it against future earnings or back to subsequent years. Did we ever you can go back to subsequent years now?
you have a carry forward now. You
It's
don't
only
have a
carry
carry back.
forward, right?
Only carry
Right.
forward.
Right. So and other than that, it's all pretty much economic development programs. You have motion picture, the Louisiana quality jobs, digital media, and that's kind of where we took aim. And I use the term we loosely because I didn't really vote for any of it, but in 2015 we trimmed a lot of economic development incentives, and it changed corporate behavior, and we really didn't net any revenue very much to speak of from it. And we were still in the same mess a year later that we were kind of in 2015 to start with. So
Right.
what
And
else? Where else can we reach?
so, I mean, again, you can take the tax incentive programs, you can look at those, but again, that's quality jobs, that's motion picture, that's digital media, the things that have attracted companies and have them moving into the state or making expansions in the state. So you will always have the issue and the argument of their incentive programs are designed to bring jobs to the state.
Right.
And we've put caps and certain changes in place. One of the incentive programs that falls in there includes the rehabilitation of historic structures. That
Right.
program was renewed during the second special session or the first special session of this year. We're still in 2020, aren't we?
Yeah. Barely.
Yes, we are still in 2020, but they removed the sunset date on that program, and that program has been very important in renewing
Yeah.
some of our historic structures and bringing them back into commerce. So
Right.
you have the trade-offs that you have to make. Digital media has been very important in bringing some digital media and IT related companies to the state. So
Yeah.
you have to make the trade-offs in that area. So severance tax, you had incentives to continue bringing onshore drilling back into the state. So if you make changes to the severance tax, will you lose the existing drilling activity that is taking place in the state? Those are
Yeah.
some of the things that you have to look at and make those hard decisions. So
Right. And
those are the
Secretary,
tough choices.
we forgot to talk about individual income tax, because if you want to eliminate some of that remaining $1 billion, you've got to look at things like the personal exemption and the standard deduction, the excess itemized deductions, the non-taxation of Social Security benefits, the retirement benefits,
The
and
state employees and teachers that we don't tax
right,
their retirement, correct.
right. So I mean, in between those three, just eyeballing it, that looks like 600 million right there.
Right. So
Maybe seven.
yeah,
It's not easy.
it's not easy. And again, it's not
Yeah.
the when you start making those tough decisions or removing the large items, then you look at that $1 billion and it's whittled down to very small things.
Right.
And again,
Right.
net income tax is paid to other states. So you take away the credit for taxes paid to other states. So you're taxing income that's been paid to
Right.
another state, and you then get into the issue of whether we have a double taxation situation and we end up with litigation. Those are just
Yeah.
some of the things we have to deal with on the exemption side. So, we've heard different things. We've heard proposals on repealing the individual income tax. So again, that's 30% of the general fund. That's individual income tax, close to $4 billion in collections. And if we are going to look at repealing the individual income tax and do away with the individual income tax at the state level, we have to replace that revenue.
Right.
Or find another way to fund the things that we are paying for at the state level. So again, the cost of K through 12 education,
Right.
that's going to be shifted completely to local government to fund, because the state's no longer going to, at least one of the legislators who have talked about the state not having the individual income tax, that we should be looking at our neighboring state of Texas, who has a property tax.
Yep.
When you look at the property tax revenues in the state, you are going to have to double the current property tax for most homeowners and business to generate the revenue that is currently coming in for the state income tax. And in some parishes, you're going to more than double.
Right.
To be able to fund the K through 12 education system. And you will note that in Texas, they have the margin tax because constitutionally, just like in Louisiana, they're mandated to provide elementary and secondary education for their citizens. And so the property tax base statewide is not generate sufficient revenue to provide an equal education for all of the citizens of the state. So the state has to make up the difference, and they fund that difference with statewide taxes.
Well, and that's I think, one of the important things to understand is that despite the fact, and it is alluring, I've got to say, to not have a personal income tax sounds fabulous, but they are no lower taxes in Texas from every piece of documentation that I can find online. Taxes in total in Texas are not lower than they are here. We actually, when you look it up on the Tax Foundation's website, can see that we actually are the lowest or the second lowest taxes in the United States when you look at total tax burden. And you can look it up. It's called Tax Freedom Day, and you'll see that we have one of the earliest tax freedom days in the country. So it's just about how you structure your revenue. And, those states that have a high tax burden on property tax, they've built their revenue base in a different way. And we chose many, many, many moons ago to have a very healthy homestead exemption, and something which a lot of people believe in very strongly, and believe that once you have your house, you shouldn't have to live under threat of losing it because you can't pay a tax bill. So, I mean, there's so many different perspectives and so much to think about on all of this. It's almost like talking to the secretary. I think we're not going to pass anything. when I talked to Jason DeQueer a few weeks ago, I thought, man, who knows what will happen? But the real nuts and bolts of it, I think, are going to come down to this next Revenue Estimating Committee meeting, which will be mid-January, and
Correct.
we have Chris Keaton, who's the new legislative fiscal officer, and Greg Albrecht, who's the state's economist, coming on the Elevate Engage podcast right after REC meets to talk about the fiscal shape of the state. And I think that that's when all of the viewers out there and the listeners will get a chance to see what's actually feasible, because I think in the scope of the talks to you and Jason, we found a lot of ideas, a lot of reasons why those ideas ought to happen, but also a lot of roadblocks. And it's a complex environment, and it's about all the time we have for today. But I do want to ask you, Secretary, if there's anything else that you'd like to add or any other thoughts?
Well, I think the important thing is that as you look to the future, you have to be mindful of the past. That is the important thing about history. We have to learn from it. We have to know what we've done, what lessons can be learned from it, and we have to plan for our future. Know that what sounds good, how green the grass may look.
Yep.
You've got to know the possibilities of what could happen when you move down that path, and learn the lessons of other states. We don't want to make decisions that lead us down a primrose path to another fiscal cliff.
Right.
We've been there. We also don't want to make hasty decisions, thinking that we can easily make swaps in our revenues, when swaps in our revenues require thoughtful decision making and recognizing that there are trade-offs and that every part of our state is not the same. The property tax base in Jefferson Parish is not the same as the property tax base in Cameron Parish.
Nope.
And Cameron Parish property tax base is not going to be the same as Ouachita Parish. So we have to be mindful as we are talking about property tax revenue replacing what has been a statewide tax base, and how we fund those important services. That's one thing that I have been very mindful of in this job. I think Jeremy Alford laughs at my Twitter description as the state's chief revenue collector, but the revenues are collected to fund state services. My focus is always on the fact that we're funding critical state services. This isn't about how much revenue we can bring in. This is about the state services and what is important to the citizens of the state, and what the elected officials that have been elected by those citizens have decided are the critical priorities.
Right.
They set those priorities in the legislation and in the budget that they pass. And so I enforce the laws that they pass, and I keep my eye on what those priorities are. Those priorities are set forth, and that's the job I have to do.
And it's probably not the easiest job ever. So,
tax collectors weren't popular in the Bible, so
Right, right. It's a tough road. It's a tough road. Well, we really appreciate your time today, and we know that as this journey to the 2021 session, hopefully singular, to the
Yes.
2021 session, as this path unwinds and we find out what's going to happen with the state fiscal. I think the thing that I'm most encouraged by is the possibility of a centralized collector, because it just sounds like that's the thing that has the most energy at the moment and the biggest shot in our particular fiscal environment of happening. So, but everybody stay tuned as the times unfold and we find out what our fiscal environment will be. We want to thank the Secretary for joining us today. Thank you so much, Secretary Robinson. For those of you who are listening, if you're interested in joining Elevate Louisiana, visit our website at elevatela.org. That's ELLEVATELA.org. You can listen to all of Elevate's Engage interviews on all platforms where you find your podcast, and also our videocast on YouTube. We will have symposiums coming up where all of the speakers will be featured on January 28th, February 5th, and February 11th. You can go on our website right now and look that up and register for those events. And we just really look forward to seeing you again soon. And I hope that you're having a happy new year. Thanks a lot. Until then, see you next time. I'm Julie Stokes.